Yesterday I asked you guys if I should make a video on the camera settings that I used when shooting that cinematic sequence with my Canon M50 that you saw in my last video, and maybe more importantly, why I use those settings when I shoot with my M50. And because this channel is a democracy and I'm not a politician, I actually listen to you guys. Here it is. But before we start, so good to see you all again. You're all amazing. It still feels a little bit weird knowing that so many of you are watching my videos, you know, small town Belgian guys sitting in an attic somewhere. But hey, I'm glad you're all here again. And if you're new here, maybe because you bought the Canon M50 Mark II, consider subscribing too, because it's a fun community here, that's for sure. Okay, now the cinematic camera settings for my Canon M50. Look, the first thing you need to know is that there's actually no such thing as cinematic camera settings. I mean, there is and there isn't. Like I've said many times before, the cinematic look is a combination of many things, and the camera settings is not the most important thing. You know, it's not necessarily what the footage looks like that makes it cinematic, it's what the viewer feels when watching it. That's what makes something cinematic. Light, composition, story, all those things are a lot more important. And also, cinematic is very subjective, you know? The thing is, I don't use these settings because they're cinematic settings. I just prefer these settings when I want a more cinematic look, you know what I mean? If you don't agree with some of these settings, that's fine, because we're in the creative business here, and I respect all opinions. No, most opinions. Maybe I am a politician after all, but okay, anyway, maybe more importantly, I also want to explain why I use these settings and why I use them for that last sequence that you saw in my last video. A lot of these settings I use on all my cameras, but some of them are specific for the Canon M50. So let's go over all the camera settings that I use for a cinematic video. Look, for me, there's only one cinematic frame rate, and that's 24 or 25 frames per second, depending on where you live. And there's a lot of different explanations why most people prefer 24 frames per second. Some say it's because our eyes are used to it, because they've been using it since forever, or some say that it's because it looks more natural because of the motion blur. All those things. The thing is, almost all movies today are shot in 24 frames per second. Maybe some scenes they use a higher frame rate because they need slow motion, but in the movie business, 24 is the standard. There's a list on Wikipedia of movies shot in a higher frame rate, and it's not a long list, guys, so there you go. But 24 or 25 frames per second, that's for real-time footage. If you want to slow down things, then of course you need a higher frame rate. 30 you can slow down by 80%, 60 frames per second by 40%, and 120 frames per second by 20%. So if you're asking me which frame rate you should use, then I would say 24 or 25 for real-time footage, 30 if you want to slow down without people noticing it, but it gives your footage a slight dreamy effect, and then 60 frames per second for slowing down people walking around and things like that, like you saw in my last sequence, and then 120 frames per second for slowing down fast action. And then finally, don't think that slowing down your footage will make it look more cinematic just because you slowed it down. Here on YouTube, slow motion is used in a lot of short sequences, but in movies, yeah, there's no movie shot entirely in slow motion, just some specific parts. But it does add some extra atmosphere. I also used slow motion in that cinematic sequence that I shot with my Canon M50 because it works for short sequences like that. I shot everything in 60 frames per second. So there's nothing wrong with that, but just remember that it won't make your footage magically look more cinematic. So bottom line is, for real-time footage, 24 or 25 frames per second. And if you want to slow down things, you have to go higher. And that's obviously for all cameras, not just the Canon M50. This is actually very simple. The only thing you need to remember is double the frame rate. So for 24 or 25 frames per second, that means 1/50th of a second. For 30 frames per second, it's 1/60th of a second, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use other settings. Of course you can, but then it becomes a creative decision because it changes what your footage looks like. You can use a slower shutter speed for 24 frames per second, and then your footage will look more choppy. You just have to make sure that when you use settings like that it works for what you're going for. And definitely don't do it for a whole project. Maybe for some specific scenes, you know what I mean? So the only thing you need to know is double the frame rate. That short sequence in my last video was shot entirely in 60 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. You know, sometimes you have to shoot everything in 60 frames per second because you don't know which footage you want to slow down. But always edit on a 24 frames per second timeline. The Canon M50 is not a top-of-the-line camera, we all know that, so there are some limitations, and I always try to keep the ISO as low as possible. Of course, it will depend on your frame rate, shutter speed, and aperture. If you shoot in 60 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, you'll have to bump up the ISO because a faster shutter speed means less light on the sensor. Same for aperture. The higher the number, the less light on the sensor, so ISO needs to go up. Now, ideally, you don't want to change the ISO for every shot, but in practice, of course, you're gonna have to, unless you bring your own lights. I find that for the Canon M50, from ISO 100 to 400, it's fine. Then, when you go to 800 and above, it starts to get iffy. You'll see a lot more noise in your footage. Now, that doesn't mean that that footage is unusable. It also depends on how much noise you can handle. You know what I mean? For me, a little bit of noise is not necessarily a bad thing. But anyway, just be aware that the Canon M50 is not a low light king. Oh, and I always use the histogram to make sure that my exposure is correct. If the histogram leans to the left, it's underexposed. That means you're gonna get noise in your footage. If it leans to the right, it's overexposed, so your highlights are gonna be 100% white, no detail. Always try to keep it in the middle. The more you go to the left, the more chance of noise. But of course, it also depends on the scene you're shooting, because if there's a bright light in your scene, it's okay for that bright light to be 100% white, to be blown out. Aperture is usually a creative choice, and I did get some questions about which aperture I used in that last sequence. I usually stick with 2.8, and for some shots I went up to 3.5. Some of you asked me why I didn't go down to 2.0. Well, that's because I feel that 2.0 is just too blurry, the background. Especially for a close-up shot. The background just disappears into a mushy nothingness. You can see it here in this shot. Another reason why I use 2.8 is because it's easier to focus when you use manual focus. You know, the shallow depth of field of 2.0, that's very difficult to get the focus right. And also, usually when you go up to 2.8, 3.5, your footage will look a tad sharper for most lenses. Also important is that you don't want to have big jumps in apertures that you use throughout the project, especially for similar shots. If, let's say, in a project or a movie, they would use different apertures every time for medium shots of a person, it would look weird and inconsistent, because in one shot the background will be blurry and in another shot it will be sharp. So always try to stick with a small range of apertures for one project, for consistency. And that's important because that brings us to the next point. Okay, so you want the frame rate to be consistent, and because of that also the shutter speed. You want ISO to be more or less consistent. Aperture also. How do you change the exposure then? Well, that's when you need ND filters. An ND filter in front of the lens will block a certain amount of light, and that means that, first of all, it will allow you to keep your aperture all the way open in bright daylight. That's what you want for a shallow depth of field. 2.8, 3.2, 3.5, but also an ND filter will allow you to adjust the exposure. You can make things brighter or darker depending on the light conditions. You can find the ones that I use in the description, but like I've said in my last video, and this is important, they're cheap options. They're not as good as the more expensive ones. So not super high quality, but for me, for most videos, they're fine. Also, I use variable ND filters that will allow you to adjust the amount of light that comes in. And usually, these are not as good as the fixed ND filters. You know, the filters that block just one specific amount of light. Unless you go for the really expensive ones. So usually for the cheap ones, the fixed NDs will be a little bit better than the variable ones. But again, for me, no problem. And finally, we have the picture style, and this is an interesting one because for a long time I've been using the CineStyle profile. It's a profile you can download for free, and while I do like it, I find it very difficult to work with, to get it right. Especially if you're a beginner, it's not a good idea. Now, for that last sequence, in my previous video, I used the neutral profile. And I like that one a lot better actually. A lot easier and still a cinematic look. Now, there are two options. You can use that neutral profile and just stick with the default settings and you're done. Or if you want a little bit more control and you want to do a little bit of color grading, you can adjust the settings. So these are my settings. Sharpness on +1, contrast to 0, saturation 0, and tone default setting. But remember, it will require you to do some basic color adjustments. In my previous video, I show you what I did in DaVinci Resolve, but it's the same for almost all editing softwares. And I think that's about it, guys. Did I forget something? I probably did, right? But just let me know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you've learned something, if you're still enjoying your Canon M50, just give this video a thumbs up. It's a great little camera that will give you great results. Just practice, practice, practice. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.